fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
This might not be the end of this little economics arc because I do have another one coming, but really the past few have been thematically similar. There's a lot of overlap, and I wanted to discuss this one book that I read that ties a lot of it together on the topic of game theory, of probability, of economics, and speculation, things like that. It was this book written by Nassim Taleb. The book is called The Black Swan. This is a fairly well-known book. A lot of people know this guy. And I got nothing negative to say about him. It's actually a very, very good book. I really liked this book. And it tied a lot of things together from the previous episodes that and expanded it to be relevant to other avenues of life outside of just economics. And you can argue that economics isn't just economics. Economics does touch on everything else. But I think this book, the concept of the Black Swan, is very illuminating. I wanted to give it its day in the spotlight. I will say, though, there are some issues with the book. It's quite long. It's around just under 400 pages. He does this thing in the book. I've seen this done before, and I don't like it. It's where it gets very autobiographical. So, in explaining this, and maybe I should have read some of his other books first, because this is a sequel to another book he did called On Robustness and Fragility. So maybe I should read that. But, it's a lot of, when I was in school and when I was growing up, and here's a little vignette from my childhood. And this is like when we cover that book Baseless, where it's about the guy trying to find all like the secrets in the Freedom of Information Act, but it's also a diary of his day to day. And so I got to read through. It's like, oh, I woke up and had a fucking croissant. The Orioles are doing bad this season. Shut up. This book had actually been half as long if he didn't have so much anecdotal stuff. And it's good. It's interesting because his life story is pretty interesting, growing up where he grew up and getting into finance and things like that. But anyway, just to give you an overview of the concept of what is a black swan. People might have heard about what a black swan is and how it relates to unpredictability and probability, but they don't really know. So we'll just kind of open with that. Like, what is a black swan event? And, the idea, you can kind of imagine a black swan is something that is irregular. It's something that breaks the norm. They would say, oh, all swans are white, until you see a black swan, which completely makes you have to rejigger what swans are. And the fact of the matter is that, and we kind of talked about this in the last one, the idea of an edge case. So when you're talking about fractals, we're talking about the Mandelbrot stuff, about like, we can't stop looking at unpredictability as edge cases. We can't look at it as an act of God or something that exists on the fringes, because they are relevant. And in fact, it is these exceptions to rules that actually change the world. And if you think about it, the story of human history across different cultures is, in my opinion, still the great man theory. And this is very unpopular with a lot of historians, where they say, great man theory, that's old hat. What it is the great movement theory. And I would say, well, that's sure, like it makes sense that you wouldn't lay the course of history on one person changing everything, but it's usually a handful of people. And we know this because a lot of times these great movements are named after a guy. The fact that it's like, oh, great men don't, change history. I'm like, well, we still have Napoleon. We still have Marxism, which is named after Marx. You can say, oh, what about Engels? I'm like, yeah, okay, so it's more than one sometimes. But really, the idea is that small pockets of people and small, very, very finite little slivers of humanity change the course of history. That's just what it is. And so the idea that these things change the norm, it's not just that something goes crazy, something big line goes up and then goes back to normal. Just like we were talking about with COVID, just like we were talking about how, we had this crazy thing for a few years called COVID, and now it's going back to normal. Not really, because we've introduced an entire generation of children to the idea that they don't know how to read faces properly because of masks. They don't know how to read emotions of people who wear masks, and they don't have enough experience with people with regular faces. So we've killed facial recognition possibly for an entire generation of people, and we don't even know the cascading effect of that yet. So that's like one crazy event that is going to have echoes, and I don't think people are really appreciating how severe that's going to be. Anyway, we talked about that. point being that histories and societies do not crawl, they jump. And that's also the industrial revolution. That's also the IT computer revolution. That within a very very short time frame, everything changes forever. So what do we do? We're existing in a world where improbable things change the world. So a Black Swan event is not only something that exists outside of the norm, but also has a huge impact and demands we make an explanation for why it happened. So it demands that we stop everything and figure out why that happened later on. That's a Black Swan event. These Black Swan events define our world. Black Swan events change history, but we're only ever really concerned about norms. And this is in an economic sense, but also a political sense and a scientific sense. We're always searching for stability. And we look at instability and roughness and irregularity as like a glitch or something that we're trying to correct. And Mandelbrot, when we were talking about fractals, this was the idea of fractals, that a lot of classical mathematicians would say that nature is smooth and balanced, and he was saying no, nature is actually rough, and we need better ways to map roughness. The irregularity itself is the regularity. And that's kind of what the Black Swan event is, part of the system. It does not exist outside the system. Furthermore, it redefines the systems themselves. And yet, in everything we do, in politics and economics and education and everything, we pretend they don't exist. And worst of all, we think that we've corrected them. And this is the story of every single boom. Like, you look at the literature and the articles that come out in every sort of new financial paradigm, they're thinking, oh, we've solved booms and busts. There's not going to be any more recessions because we learned from the last ones. We're post uncertainty, we're post instability. That's never happened. But we desire it so much, and we purposefully ignore the improbable. And he makes the claim early on, and I think this is kind of what I'm trying to get at most of all, and I don't really know where to go with this, but this is very much an accelerationist idea of the future, where our current brains are no longer designed to process the world that we've created, especially in the future. And I really want people to think about that a lot of people agree that this modern world we live in is maddening. It's true, and it makes demands of us. And we talked about this. They were talking about this even in the 50s and 60s, about this idea of television is fundamentally changing how human beings process information. And we've changed the way we think and interact with each other and everyone. And this idea is that in this new modern world, and we talked about this in the last episode, where if you look at the financial market, since the 80s, the entire market is taking bigger swings, higher peaks and lower valleys. So instability is the norm. But our brains, biologically, evolutionarily, are not designed, whatever you want me to design means, either we evolved that way or we were actually designed that way by some creator, whatever. We're not designed to actually process the world we've created. We don't know how to do it. That's why we have these huge blind spots for how the world actually works and why we're always surprised by it. And the question is, will that increase in the future? I say yes. Maybe I'm too cynical, but I do think it's not going to get any more sane, at least within our lifetimes. Probably not ever, actually.
Yeah.
I think it will only exponentially get more complicated. And but we need processes, and we need to redo our thinking. We need to realign ourselves to first realize that this world, a very complicated world, it doesn't play by the same rules as before, just like the financial market. It doesn't. It's so divorced from that. And we can fix it. We can fix certain things, obviously. But I do think we need to recognize what the actual problems are. And he says there's 3 errors in prediction on this topic. There's 3 errors. One is not identifying variability. So straight up just not identifying at all that there's such a thing as these wide variances. 2 is not being able to gauge length of time properly, so degradation. So we're not very good at long time horizons. That's kind of shrunk for us, the average person. And the third is the third random variable. So we don't actually test for variability, and we don't think of something that's truly random. And something that's truly random could also be a streak, like we talked last time, because if something was truly random, for a lot of people, they would think streaks shouldn't exist. If you flip a coin, if I flip a coin 100 times, it makes no sense that like 15 times in a row, it would come up the same one. That's not really random, but it actually is. So, and ironically, it's gamblers that are best equipped to know this. So, another thing that he had said is, like I just said, the modern world, based on everything I just said, actually amplifies Black Swan events. So not only do we exist in a very complicated, crazy world, the opportunity for events that exist outside the norm to have a disproportionate impact actually maximizes, so they can happen more frequently. So that's why, if you look back on the 18th, 17th century, there's wars and there's innovations and stuff, but within the past century alone, there's been such a maximization of volatility that is unprecedented. It really is. Despite all the disease, despite all the war, all the bad things that happened in the past, the fact that there's so many unpredictable but society redefining things in the 20th century alone, that's never happened before. So that alone should give people pause. He actually has a quote from Karl Popper in here about how bad we are at prediction, because that's the one thing we're actually trying to solve for. How can we actually predict the future, or at least have a sense of something that can happen in the future? He said, historical prediction and sociology should actually be downgraded to something at the level of aesthetics. Like, he's like, we're so bad at prediction, it's not even scientific. It's just something that we talk about, like don't even pretend there's scientific value. And he says that, we're so bad at predicting, but science also has no direction. And that's kind of what he was getting at with his quote. It's like, first of all, we're bad at predicting the future. Secondly, we have this thing called science, our worship of science. And he's not anti-science, but he's saying that science itself, and this is something scientists will deny, is that science actually has no direction. It has no moral alignment. It kind of says it's working towards a theory of everything, but that's more theoretical physics. Scientists actually they just go in every direction, and they're innovating in every single direction at once. If you give scientists millions and millions of dollars, give them all the money you have, they will shoot off in every single possible direction, which means that since they have no alignment, that alone also maximizes Black Swan events. That's where you get, like, maybe something goes wrong with the Large Hadron Collider. Maybe you've made the wrong disease in a lab and it gets out. Like, things like that start to happen when you combine our inability to predict the future and the fact that we're going in every fucking direction and pouring more and more money into it. Like, the space race alone is going to introduce, holy shit, the idea of just private companies colonizing Mars. Like, you have no idea how insane it's going to get. No science fiction writer can accurately predict how insane it's going to get, except maybe The Star Is My Destination, I think, was a pretty good one. I like that one. But other than that, and it's not just because that's the first book that dared to have a rapist as the main character, a caveman rapist. That's not why. And one thing he says, and this is also what I'm trying to get at, that systems need randomness to remain anti-fragile. Now, anti-fragile is a word that comes up a lot with him. So he's an anti-guy. He's got a book called Anti-Fragile out as well. And he has one thing in here that I didn't really I didn't like. He was talking about how, some of the smartest people and the most capable and well-learned people have these huge libraries full of books they don't read. And the average person be like, oh, you have all these books, why don't you read them? He's like, actually, that's an anti-library. And it's good to have an anti-library of things you want to do but will never do. I'm like, I don't know about that. I just think that sounds like a cope that you just want. You're a guy who bought
too many books. Yeah.
Yeah. And I get that. That's something I would like, because I have a lot of books that I haven't gotten to, and this is tailor-made, fits me like a glove. Yeah. But I can't do it. I must deny you.
My wife's going to read this. I better throw something in there.
Yeah. My bitch wife is going to read this book. I better. He wrote this whole book to excuse the fact that he's got too many books, and doesn't have the gumption to kill his wife. No, but his systems need randomness. Like, you actually need to stress test your system. And when we discuss politics, when we discuss political ideologies, Marxism, fascism, and stuff, we design these systems to be complete and stable, as we should, because humans desire stability. We want to make these perfect little intricate systems that solve all the problems, and it's balanced and it's safe and it can run forever. But and we've mentioned this before, you kind of do need a pocket of anarchy within every system. Like you do need an academia to question things all the time, because otherwise you'll become this big mechanical ossified thing. Like you become a dead empire. That's just the only reason you survive is just because you haven't been attacked yet. That was a lot of empires throughout history, where it's like, I'm stable, but it's not because I'm healthy. It's just because I'm untouched.
So something that is fragile, if you map it properly mathematically, you realize that the fragile is what does not like disorder. It doesn't want mishandling. It doesn't want volatility. It wants peace and predictability. So the opposite of that would be something that loves volatility. What I'm saying may sound interesting and new, but it's not to the option traders I worked with, because I was an option trader for 20 years before becoming calling myself all these names, all right? I was just a simple option trader before. But my publishers now, they want to hide it, but the fact is, and option traders, they understand the world of yours in two different dimensions. There are things that don't like volatility and things that like volatility. And it's very, very extremely bipolar view of the world, okay? You don't almost have nothing in between. And effectively, all I did is generalize this idea to map it, to things that option traders, because option traders, all they do is they drink and they trade options, all right? So they don't have exposure outside of that narrow field. So all I'm doing is representing them to take the idea outside. And we can do a lot of things, because effectively, fragility is something I can measure, and anti-fragility is something I can measure. But risk you can't really measure, unless, of course, you're at Harvard or Stanford or one of these places where they have the illusion of they can measure risk. But in reality, we can't measure risk. It's something in the future. I can measure fragility.
And he gives the example of intermittent fasting. Like, to be healthy, you might want to do some intermittent fasting. Make yourself suffer on purpose to show, where your weak spots are to remain healthy. So, that's a reasonable enough thing to say. That's why this sort of thing is valuable, this investigation, to test your assumptions, to test your strength, to see, like we discussed in the last episode, about the idea of turbulence. And I want to come back to this, the idea that we're very bad at predicting turbulence. We can't do it. There's too many variables. We don't really know what causes turbulence. It's too much. It's like the butterfly effect in a way. It's like we don't know what causes it, but we know it happens. But the fact that turbulence exists and we can't predict it doesn't mean that we can't have airplanes. It just means we had to make airplanes with turbulence in mind. So what that means is we cannot make systems that function unless we design these systems to withstand these Black Swan events. And the systems we currently have aren't very good at it. So we need to design systems knowing that improbable redefining events can exist and how to grapple with them and not be destroyed by them. And that's kind of the problem. A good example would be like California. They know they're on I believe it's the San Andreas fault lines, one of the biggest fault lines in the world. Everyone knows, one big earthquake, this entire city is gone. And it's also in the place in the world that's the most likely to have one of those earthquakes.
Yeah.
And they haven't factored that into how they build their buildings. Shit, they haven't factored that in, that most of our, IT infrastructure is there as well, in the most volatile, easy to destroy place on Earth. And I'm like, we should operate in a reality where we know that one day just a little shift in the tectonic plates can take us out. Maybe we move that stuff elsewhere. Maybe, what I mean? Like stuff like that. We actually haven't built our cities to withstand this. And they talk about it all the time. They talk about, we haven't updated most of these buildings since the 30s. I'm like, okay. Okay, that's bad. Why are you, like the forest fire? How many fucking forest fires are you going to get for? It's like we need a different type of tree here. Like all these palm trees. The thing about palm trees is they exude this oil that makes them highly flammable. Like, okay, get rid of them, you fucking retards. I don't get this. I don't get, like, we need to do this. Like, I'm sounding like a climate guy right now. I get, like, guys, we need to do this. I'm not saying we need to get rid of fossil fuels. I'm just saying, like, littler things, like how we build any system period, needs to take into this account. Anyway, I'm getting off on something here, but anyway, he says like people suffer from an inability to read history in three ways. One is the illusion of understanding. So something happens, something unpredictable happens. You look back on it, like, oh, I get why that happened. So because I get why that happened, I get why the next thing will happen, and you actually don't. That's not how it works. Retrospective distortion is the second thing. So, the fact that you're looking back on the past, you actually don't have all the information. So you might just think you understand it because you have like rose tinted glasses in some way. And relying on handicapped authority. So I'll give you one example. One I read yesterday, and this was an interesting article that was forwarded by one of the guys in our chat. And I'm not saying that I believe this completely, but it's an example of what I'm talking about, where they were talking about the housing crisis in the early 2000s, the one we all know about. All the movies are made about the mortgage crisis, all that stuff. And the common line is that, this was because of housing prices being overvalued, and that's what caused the recession. They took sort of the flipped version where actually it didn't cause the recession. It was a result of the recession. So other forces caused the recession, and this was just a symptom of it. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire article, but the idea that something as recent as the housing crisis can have such a variety of opinions on what caused it is kind of what we're talking about here. Also, like you and I had talked about the Great Depression, like it was Milton Friedman and some of these other economists who said actually the cause of the Great Depression might not have been the banks doing this or that. It might have been actually the government's fault for some of the policies the government acted that manufactured it. Again, not saying that is what happened. However, there's a variety of interpretations of stuff that even happened in economics where we disagree with what the causes even were. So that handicaps our ability to even learn from the past. And that's what kind of blinds us, is what he's saying. We call this the problem of induction, a very, very old problem of our inability to plan the future based on events from the past. And he makes the claim that categorization is so essential to humans, but it becomes pathological. We kind of get trapped in our desire to put the past in these little mason jars and learn from it, but we actually don't get better at predicting the future as a result. And so, while we can learn from the past, and we should read more history, we should read more books from people like Antelope Hill, Imperium Press, Arctos, all those people, like learn the past, but also know that that's not really going to save us much in the future. It can inform, we can know what works, and knowing that stuff knows, but really there is a black box here that is not, there's a lot of stuff it's not going to help us with. Mm-hmm. And he kind of talks about negative empiricism, about knowing what you don't like is worth more. I won't get into that, but and he said there's actually two types of black swans, and this is another way to look at it: the negative black swans and positive black swans. So he says positive black swans actually take a while to go, like the computer, and a lot of philosophical theories. One of the things if you read about history and philosophy and a lot of these more academic things, is sometimes the biggest movements or the biggest ideas that shook the scene were discovered like 100 years before, but for whatever reason they didn't take off. You know what I mean? And sometimes it just takes that long for an idea to take off. So sometimes something like the computer took decades, but it changed everything. Negative black swan events, however, happen very fast. So he says the example is the computer versus computer stocks crashing. Mm-hmm. That's a good example of two things that change society. And the reason is, oftentimes he says the greatest discoveries are slow black swans because there's a solution looking for a problem. Now, just a bit of a side note, and this is something I encountered when I was working with startups in the past. I was working at a startup hub, and I saw this all the time, that you get a bunch of highly competent, amazing, like charismatic, well-read engineers, guys who invented a thing. And it's a very, very good thing. It's it might be a new type of medical technology that can predict this or that, but this is where marketers come in, where it's like, okay, who's this for? And they don't know yet. They just know that this hasn't been invented yet. The fact that it exists now is a big fucking deal, but it's like, where do we put it? Who do we give it to? What do we? Who's using it? Like, how do we convince people to use this? And they're like, they didn't actually ask that question first. And it doesn't mean the thing they invented or innovated was good, but it's just like, we don't have we're not ready for this yet. And I don't know when we will be. I think there's that movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, with Will Smith. And it's another one he slapped out of the park. But it was about this guy. He was trying to sell bone density scanners. It was this thing. You can study bones, and he was trying to sell it to doctors, and they weren't buying because whatever reason. But it's like, yeah, it's a new piece of tech. There's all kinds of new tech that for whatever reason doesn't take off, and it might be a matter of time. Some ideas just need their day, and they're slow. But I like he says, it's a solution looking for a problem. This is actually what marketing is about, by the way. If I can just put a feather in my own cap, which this cap has many feathers of my own design currently. But the idea is that, marketers, their job is to say, okay, you got a good thing. I got to bridge the gap between the public or the profession or whatever it is to make them understand how good this is. Because a lot of times they won't unless with a little help from your friends. He also delineates between type of black swans. And this is something, a little thing that I thought was really interesting, where there's two types of black swans, ones with narrative power and those without. So the narrative ones are ones you can kind of attach a story to, because he says sometimes we will latch on to trying to predict certain black swan events because they have very good narrative power, but they actually don't. We're kind of wasting our time with that. And one would be, the collapse of civilization. And this is something we've come up against a lot in our communities, where I'm like, everyone secretly thinks that what we're going to end up in is The Road by Cormac McCarthy, or some film or TV show where it's the end of the world. It's kind of like a zombie apocalypse. But I'm like, okay, what if it doesn't look? We need to kind of disengage our obsession with that specific outcome and thinking like, oh, I can chart a course from what we do now to how we get there. I'm like, let's say that never happens. We might actually be sabotaging our effectiveness by obsessing about this future that we're certain is going to happen. Right. But it has narrative power. It's a good story we want to invest in. But the fact that we're focusing so much of our predictability on that one outcome means that we might be missing a bunch of other outcomes that might in fact be worse. But that one's got the most narrative power for whatever reason. And trying to predict those black swan events, the event where like society collapses, doesn't make those events more likely to happen, actually. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we like narrative stories not only because we like patterns, but because stories are an easy way to archive in the brain, whereas just information, we don't really know what to do with information. So I'll give you an example. There was a study they did, referencing the book here, a study where adding a reason to the likelihood of something happening makes people rate it more likely. So if we were to say 1,000 people will die in a flood in America, studies show that people rate that as unlikely. If I say 1,000 people will die in a flood in America due to an earthquake in California, all of a sudden the likelihood of that shoots up. Yeah. So when you attach a reason to something, something in our brains where we say, oh, that's more likely to happen. So for some black swan events, like, realize, are we actually obsessed with this because it's most likely, or we've just attached enough stories to it that we can't break our fixation on it to the detriment of our actual futures? You see what I'm saying? So, and we hate abstracts. We prioritize reason. So think about that. You can convince anyone of anything as long as you add some reason to it. Now you can use that for good or evil, but just realize that that is a tactic that your enemies can also use. And also, what we know, this one side of our brain is more literal than the other. Our determination to find patterns and theories actually limit us in perceiving facts. And he's got a quote here. So he's got this phrase here. It's like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, but people have seen this before, where you read a sentence, but it's slightly off, but your brain actually auto-completes it. So, but it's actually written, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. He said, the Sydney-based brain scientist Alan Snyder made the following discovery. If you inhibit the left hemisphere of a right-handed person, you lower his rate of error in reading the caption.
The first surprise is that after the stimulation, Mike has instantly spotted the double V.
Everybody sees the two V's, but they somehow don't access it. What the TMS does is what I think exists in a savant all the time, is that it gives you privileged access to lower level, raw sensory information that's obviously in all of us.
Mike's brain now notices the double V because the magnetic stimulation beamed into his left hemisphere has turned off the higher thinking processes located there. This has caused his brain to switch on circuits in the right hemisphere that enable him to see detail more readily.
You can look at the hemispheres as a struggle. There's a kind of tension between them, with the left normally oppressing or suppressing the right. And by inhibiting the left, we disinhibit, we free up the right.
Our propensity to impose meaning and concepts blocks our awareness of the details making up the concept, because one hemisphere of your brain is for like literally interpreting facts and the other is processing them into a story, into something that you can use. So by literally inhibiting that one side of the brain, it makes the other, and you rely more on the other hemisphere of the brain, it makes you more accurate in reading and interpreting data. So in that sense, the very thing that makes us categorize information can work against us if presented data and our ability to actually parse through and find the truth in that data. If you zap the person's left hemispheres, they become more realistic. They can draw better and with more vermicelitude. Their minds become better at seeing the objects themselves, cleared of theories, narratives, and prejudice. Now, again, not to say that these things are all useless. However, if presented with new information, it can prove an impediment, because we're always trying to see how does this fit in with what we already know. So in a biological sense, we need to like force ourselves to see things we're not familiar with, because these things might also really fuck us up. Either we ignore them or we kind of wallpaper over them. And then this is where we obsess about reasons and plans. And things don't make sense to us if we don't have a villain. This is why, for us, like this thing we're working on in Blood Satellite, we're kind of working towards is my fixation on the concepts of phenomena and momentum. These two things where, on the right, we know bad things are happening. We have things we don't like, but we're so determined to find the villain and to divine the motivation behind what causes it. And this is kind of like with the Great Reset stuff. If we say all this crazy shit's happening, who's behind it? Why are they doing it? I say, I actually don't care why they're doing it. All I really care about is the phenomena itself. I don't, because the person or people who are behind it, let's say it's George Soros. We don't like George Soros. We're no friends of George Soros here. If George Soros dies, what his mission does not stop. The Open Society Foundation does not cease to be. It's beyond the people. It is a phenomenon. It's a mechanism or a machine that can have as many or as few people as necessary. So, I actually don't care about what Darth Vader is lurking in the shadows. All I need to know is that I don't like what is happening, and I need to figure out why, irrespective of any elite attached to it. So that's what we're talking about here. It's like, I don't actually need it to be a story. I don't need us to be a plucky rebelling against this group and we rise up, because every revolution that's attempted that has also failed. That's one thing we refuse to learn, that once we swap out elites with our elites, the same things kind of happen. And we'll get into this later when we talk about the tragedy of great power politics by Mearsheimer. But the idea central to this is like, I don't want to waste my time really caring about the motivations of the individuals. I do care that the people who are oppressing us have names and addresses. That is valuable. And I think you should use that. But also I think that the larger question is like, what is the phenomena we're against? And to fight that phenomena, it's going to require more than taking out people or swapping them with different people. Because that's liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is saying everything that goes wrong is this guy. Let's put in a new guy. Oh, wow, some things are the same. Let's just keep swapping in guys until we find the right one. I'm like, well, that's not a good system. Searching for a magic guy is... It's okay, keep trying, but in the meantime, is there something else we can do? Anyway, we'll talk about this more in the future. Sorry, did you have something to say?
No, I was just gonna. It is related to what we were talking about a few weeks ago. Changing strategies from playing against playing a finite game versus an infinite game. Remember, like the idea that it isn't really about your opponent. It's about your opponent and all future opponents and the fundamental system by which those opponents even exist. That's actually what you're attacking. Never mind this opponent. Maybe the strategy is actually to support them. Who knows? Because you're not really fighting them. You're fighting, like you said, a phenomenon.
There's this interesting story he's got in here about how showing like how a 5-year plan. I'm just going to read the story. It's about how a 5-year plan fails. So, in the summer of 1998, I worked at a European-owned financial institution. It wanted to distinguish itself by being rigorous and far-sighted. The unit involved in trading had 5 managers, all serious-looking, who had to meet throughout the summer in order to formulate the 5-year plan. This was supposed to be a meaty document, a sort of user's manual for the firm. A 5-year plan? To a fellow deeply skeptical of central planner, the notion was ludicrous. Growth within the firm had been organic and unpredictable, bottom up, not top down. It was well known that the firm's most lucrative department was the product of a chance call from a customer asking for a specific but strange financial transaction. The firm accidentally realized that they could build a unit just to handle these transactions, since they were profitable, and it rapidly grew to dominate their activities. The managers flew across the world in order to meet Barcelona, Hong Kong, etc. A lot of miles for a lot of verbiage. Needless to say, they were usually sleep deprived. Being an executive doesn't require a very developed frontal lobe, but rather a combination of charisma, a capacity to sustain boredom, and the ability to shallowly perform on harrying schedules. Add to these tasks the duty of attending opera performances. The managers sat down to brainstorm during these meetings about, of course, the medium-term future. They wanted to have vision. But then an event occurred that was not in the previous 5-year plan. The Black Swan of the Russian federal default of the Russian financial default of 1998 and the accompanying meltdown of the values of Latin American debt markets. It had such an effect on the firm that, although the institution had a sticky employment policy of retaining managers, none of the 5 were still employed there a month after the sketch of the 1998 5-year plan. Yet I am confident that today the replacements are still meeting to work out the next 5-year plan. We never learn. I like that. And I've lived this reality, and it kind of gave me pause where I'm thinking, we always sketch out the idea of sketching out a 5-year vision while not taking into account like how you actually got there was chance, and not working within that reality, and not taking that as it was an aberration, but we should use that to maybe make ourselves more impervious to these changes, which were likely to happen. Like, why wouldn't there a country default? We even still behave in that mode right now. Like, a lot of us are talking about like what happens if, the petrodollar changes. What happens if, the American reserve currency is not the hegemonic alternative going forward? Some people are asking those questions. We just don't know. We almost don't want to think about it. And we're over here asking, in North America, how uncomfortable are you willing to be? Here's a conversation to start thinking about the unpredictable future. Don't talk about what's likely to happen. Talk about what could happen. That's a fun way to do it. Like, what's the worst thing that could happen? Not what's likely. Forget likely. Forget probable. Are you willing to live like an Italian? Are you willing to have their level of unemployment? Are you willing to have multi-generational homes? Are you willing, like, a lot of Europeans, Canadians especially, live like this. Like, if you're an American, are you willing to live like a Canadian? And really think about what that is. Because we complain about our food prices. Our food prices are crazy high. Well, so is a lot of people. So in Eastern Europe, food prices are high. Imports are high. We're just kind of used to it. Yes, our average income actually is pretty fucking low. But then mix that with like no one can afford to own land and everyone's renting. To have a house, you need to have your grandparents and your parents in there. Are you willing? How much of your comforts are you willing to give up? Are you willing to have to learn 3 languages just to get by? That's what, every time I talk to a European, there's a lot of Europeans in our chat. I forget, I'm like, oh yeah, you have to like this podcast, you had to learn a new language. And that's normal to them. That's not normal to Canadians. We say we learn French. We don't really. Americans kind of have to learn Spanish. Like, you add some more. Add the fact that in a multipolar world, in a less comfortable world, you got to really learn Spanish. And maybe you really got to learn Mandarin. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to not be able to afford anything? And before I go off on this, like there's a lot of good say. I was on an anti-car chat, an anti-vehicle ownership chat, and I'm not anti-vehicle, but they did raise a couple good points. One of the points was that if you look at where government policy intersected with American growth, the idea of we actually want to expand things horizontally more than vertically. We actually want to place Walmarts further out just so we can build more roads because we have certain subsidies that reward extra road building. So a lot of America, not all of it, but a lot of it was we need to build roads for the sake of building roads. And we need to place things further apart than they should just because we can. And it's like, okay, that's going to get very real very fast. That's going to get the fact that, oh, we can't afford these roads anymore. You're going to have a lot of abandoned fucking places. So are you ready for that? Yeah. Are you ready to get real in America? Because I'm not ready. I'm not ready to get real. It sucks in Canada. You know, you're going to get Canadian real fucking fast. I hope you like the feeling of rake.
Is it just me or is it getting Canadian in here? Jeez.
Oh man, where does denim come from? And then another example of this is like how information can cloud you. It's like they did another study where they showed two groups of people a blurry fire hydrant, and then step by step, like, you know, when you're at an optometrist's office and they do, is it better, is it worse, testing. So it went from very blurry to, you know, picture perfect, and then they had to say, you know, stop when they start to see it, right? So they found that both groups, one was faster than the other. One became clear slower, one became clear faster. And they found that the one became clear faster, people could predict that it was a fire hydrant sooner. So which means the more time people got to actually process and think about what they were seeing, the more they actually sabotage themselves. Whereas the people where it's like, you know, faster, go, what is it? Fire hydrant. I know what that is. The brain could actually figure it out, the correct answer faster, the faster it was. And the more information and time that was given, the less accurate they were. Now, you know, you could say that's just one study, but it's an illuminating study, I think, that sometimes the amount of noise that we're given, the amount of information that we're given can sabotage us. And it's just another opportunity for us to find patterns where they don't exist. And this is not anti-conspiracy theory, by the way. We are conspiracy theory guys. We are the, you know, great reset fearers. That is us, more than a lot of people. But there also is a tendency for us to find patterns where there are no patterns by introducing more information to us. And this is where, you know, there's this concept of super forecasters. We've mentioned this on the show before. A super forecaster is someone who doesn't invest all of their investigative potential in one area. They're a jack of all trades. They look at a lot of different things and try and create a theory of the world from that. You know, they don't invest too much because you can actually learn how a system works better from borrowing from a lot of things and finding patterns that way, instead of like drilling too deep into one specific thing, which is actually what we do in philosophy. That's why there's so much fighting in the philosophy community. Mm-hmm. I think he gives the example of hedgehogs versus foxes. Hedgehogs become married to one huge improbable event, whereas a fox will look at a bunch of different probabilities. So a hedgehog in this case would be someone who's like only focused on like one specific collapse scenario. You know, like if your thing is peak oil, you're going to see peak oil everywhere, and you're going to ignore maybe other things that you should be concerned about. Anyway, that's just what that little kind of detour I thought was kind of interesting. So just to end this, he gives a bunch of recommendations at the end. That's why I like this book. It wasn't just like a bunch of anecdotes and studies and stories. He said, here's some steps to move forward. And I would recommend this for anyone in our scene to apply them however you think. You might say it's all bullshit, but I think there's a few things. If you're starting a movement, a political organization, a group of friends doing a thing, a business, whatever, if you're starting a business for you and your guys, because you're going to have to, because you got no stability. There's no job stability in a skyscraper in your future. So first of all, he asks, if you're starting a business, decide if your business is a positive or negative Black Swan business. Meaning, Does your business require uncertainty to go right or go wrong? So an example would be like a national security agency. Like I'm a security agency, so I need to. If a black swan happens, that's very, very bad. Or a black swan can happen in another environment where when it happens, it's actually good. So there's that. Invest in preparedness, not prediction. This is kind of what we were getting at. If you're starting an organization, a firm, a movement, a revolution, whatever it is, design it to withstand unpredictability. Don't invest so much energy in trying to predict things because you will fail. Figure out how to build a better airplane, not a turbulence prediction engine. That's where that recommendation comes from. Maximize exposure to opportunities over plans. Now, this isn't one we talked about, but I like this a lot. So the idea is like you cannot actually predict opportunities. And the more you try and predict it, the worse it is. And anecdotally, in my life, everything good that has happened to me professionally, personally, politically, has been when I just took a swing and didn't have an intricate plan to do something. That's actually this podcast. This podcast, which has been amazing for us in every single way in building a community and getting us going and assisting our lives. It just started on a lark and we didn't actually plan it. And, starting a business, getting a job, finding a romantic partner, like people who found their wives or husbands, odds are you didn't have like this careful plan to find the perfect mate.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of single people doing that. Yeah. And, so what you want to do is create a system where you actually maximize opportunities over plans. And you can, let's apply this to fighting too. Who's the better fighter? The guy who's just jumped into a ring and sparred a lot, or a guy who's planned his perfect reactions to every fight, right? You want to put yourself in a position where you can meet more people, discover things about yourself. And when we talked about the lean business model, the idea of not starting this big behemoth of a company, starting a small company to test your assumptions on the market. And you'll learn faster and sooner and better, and your failures will be more manageable. So apply that to everything. Apply that to starting a group. Just do it and try and learn and talk to people and make relationships, and don't like get all up in your head creating the perfect little mathematical like model for what's going to save the world. Beware the precise plans of governments is another one. And he says, don't waste time fighting forecasters. And this is something I need to improve with. And I sometimes I forget this, me especially, but others as well, but mainly me, which is if you disagree with someone's prediction of the future, don't even fucking bother arguing with them. You can argue with them in the sense that you want to test your own. Right? Like I have an idea of what'll happen. Let's hash it out. But usually that only needs to happen a little bit. What happens is people just keep fighting with each other about what their predictive model is going to be. And they're usually all wrong. Most people predicting how this Russia versus Ukraine conflict are going to go have been wrong.
Yeah.
I've seen it. I've seen people who should know better making predictions that turn out not to be right. And then they need to cope later. But then they still keep fucking doing it. Whereas I'm like, why don't we take that energy and learn what we can from this conflict and create a better airplane in a sense, instead of like, I got it. I figured out precisely what Russia's going to do next. Is it a second offensive? That's not what you should be spending your fucking time on. That's not a predictive model that can even be replicated. Really. Like this is just so much gayer than gambling. And also he asks this at the end, and we can end on this in that same sort of milieu. How can we gauge an expert? On the right, do we actually have any mechanisms for which we can tell when someone's an expert at something? Like what does an expert leader, an expected organizational mind actually look like? Do we actually know? Can we separate a smart person from a dumb person? Do we know an informed person from a charismatic person, or a reasonable organizational mind from someone who's just good at debating? I don't think we have that. And those are questions we need to ask ourselves. And this is why we need to be like, okay, how do we take these ideas and these debates and map them onto the world to actually test if they work? And this is why a lot of, us predicting what geopolitical conflicts will end up as, it's like, well, most people have been wrong, and them being wrong has not actually impacted how they predict things. We still treat it like we're at a fucking craps table. So we haven't learned, and B, We don't have a better way to test whether or not our ideas work. We're at the level where it's like, well, let's get together and hang out. And I'm not saying I'm getting on anyone's case about this. I'm saying we need to figure out a way to test our ideas in action in some way, and to tell the difference between, I'll put it another way, a genuine person and a grifter. We don't even know that yet. We struggle with that, and all of our stuff has to have some practicality. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. Did you have any closing thoughts on that?
No, other than that, I agree. No.
Your agreement nationalism is the way forward. Okay, well, I was listening to this podcast. It was Matt and Shane's secret podcast. They're funny, and they were talking about it. I was dating a control freak. It's like, bro, I'm an acceptance freak. I'm a freak. Like, I just go with it. It's like whatever they want to do. I'm like, I'm game. I'm stuck being an acceptance freak. And they're talking about how funny it is, like when you're that person that leads you to blow up later, and the person who's like a control, those people tend to find each other. Yeah. And then they're like, I want to do this. And if you just go with it, but then every so often, you always do this. You never let me pick anything. And then the other person's surprised because you've always seemed cool with it. And I'm like, I got to make sure don't be an acceptance freak in a situation, because then you'll just like spurg out at some point.
Yeah. Fuck.
Anyway, this has been a bit of a long one. Thank you for taking the time. I know you.
Yeah, no worries, man. It's good.
You got real life things. You got daughters who don't know faces.
We all have. No, my kids know. Yeah, they got lots of faces. They're good.
They got lots of faces, but it's
all right. I appreciate the conversation. I think that this is a good one to get onto, just because of the moment that we're in, and there is a huge amount of predictions going on, being flung around, and a lot of people are angry. A lot of people about it. I think the advice to essentially ignore these people is valid, and I think we do need to look at how we can narrow down the people that we're even bothering to listen to. Who was it? Somebody was saying in the chat. So I think it was roughly.
Yeah.
Somebody was saying
I was about to say the same thing.
Yeah, just breaking it down. Let everybody go their separate ways. We can cooperate occasionally when there's something that we obviously all agree on, but big tent is bullshit. And I think we're really seeing that come to the front right now.
And I like that. I like when people do their own thing. Like anyone who's got their own thing going, I say, good for you. Keep up the good work. So if you're the type of person, and this is what I have to do, and this is what I've done in the past, where I look at someone, they're saying something I don't like bullshit. They're not right. They're wrong. Well, do I know what's right? Well, if I do know what's right, if I know where they're wrong, I should be doing something parallel to them. I should be doing something similar. Like, what do I actually know? I should test it out. If I know where all these people are wrong, I guess I should put up or shut up. And that's something I try and make myself do. So otherwise you'll end up where a lot of people are, where you just spend all your time complaining about what people talk about, which is not what I'm interested in. I have my opinions where some people are incorrect. But when we talk about infighting, I don't talk about infighting as like, oh my God, we can't do that. We're strong. I'm just like, you know what? Like, I think that's taking time away from what we should be doing, which is at the very least figuring out what the right way forward is. And once you do that, you'll actually fight less. You'll hate just as many people. I'm no less hateful than I was, but I do find I fight a bit less.
Yeah.
And that's what you want to be. You want to be a hateful but silently hateful nationalism is what we need.
Quiet, very angry, and secretly violent nationalism.
We need ring wraith nationalism. We need just the only time you open your mouth is to do like a crow scream or some kind of shrill terror that emits from the hole in your face.
So low functioning autism nationalism.
Autism, but in a goth cloak.
Yeah.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.